In this episode, the featured film brings to the screen a classic love story, adds enormously to the catalog of stage-to-screen masterpieces, and contributes to keeping alive the memory of a poet for the ages. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Romeo and Juliet was released in 1968. The first screenplay was written around 1594. The final screenplay for this film was written about 400 years later. Well, how can we talk about William Shakespeare and his plays and poetry? In this case, we are going to focus on his plays because, of course, that is what is adapted to the movies. And Romeo and Juliet, I believe, is a fantastic example of such an adaptation. So when we think about the viewership for Shakespeare in the movies and on television, I think it comes down to two groups. Those of us who love Shakespeare, viewers who love Shakespeare, of which I am a member, and people who either are not comfortable with Shakespeare or have had little or no exposure to Shakespeare. And this is troubling because, as many writers have said lately, that so many of the great writers of the last 400 or 500 years are disappearing. If we think of Renaissance England, the time of, or Elizabethan England, there were so many wonderful playwrights and poets, but all of them are fading out of memory with Shakespeare holding on, as they say, by the fingernails. So I tried to figure out, why is that the case? Why is it that we who love Shakespeare find him timeless and will endure forever, and yet the scales are tipped against us, and there is a chance that Shakespeare might, not will, but might disappear from memory? I think back to my high school days when most of us were exposed to the plays of Shakespeare. Was there a problem there that prevented our pure enjoyment of it or appreciation of what we were studying? First of all, I think one of the problems is that magic word, study. Of all the books we had to learn in English class in high school, did any of them stay with us? How many people became readers because of that, or how many people rebelled because of that? I think I remember only 3 plays that we studied in high school: Romeo and Juliet, Twelfth Night, and The Merchant of Venice. Now, why those 3 were chosen, I have no idea. And maybe today a different set of plays are chosen, if they are being taught in high school at all. I hope they are. But I remember that this was not a pleasant experience. And I would have to say this: we read the plays. They were handed out our books of Shakespeare, and probably a book per play, as it's very common to have a small paperback in those days. But I must say that in my entire life, I have never seen Shakespeare performed on the stage. And that is tremendously disappointing, and I hope to rectify that someday. But I never did. So our entire exposure, our class, not every class, was by reading the plays and not by watching them. Now, I think that has changed dramatically since I was in high school for 2 reasons. One is, there has always been many excursions to places such as Stratford in Ontario, Canada, where I'm from, that puts on Shakespearean plays all the time. Sometimes they're done in the cities, outdoors in the summertime. But the second reason, which is even more important, is they will appear in movies and on television. And I think this is very important. If I was to have a Shakespeare class today, I think the first thing I would do is take the class to see the play we are going to study. Go see a performance of Romeo and Juliet, or go to a hall with a big screen and watch one of the many versions of Romeo and Juliet, or whatever the play is that we're about to study. I think it makes a tremendous difference, even for people of high school age, to appreciate what they're about to see. And I think it's undeniable that even at an early age, watching something on movies or television is much better than reading it in a book. I'm not blaming the high school system or the education system, because I left high school with not a tremendous appreciation of Shakespeare, but I was aware of William Shakespeare. I was aware of many of the plays that he had written. It was only in university, in my post-secondary years, where pursuing an English literature degree, I took an entire year of one subject only, and that was the plays of Shakespeare. And that's where I fell in love with Shakespeare. In addition to that, in the late 70s and beyond, there were many, many Shakespearean plays made into movies. Hamlet, Richard III, Henry V, to be sure, Romeo and Juliet, and many, many more. There are very few plays of Shakespeare's that have not been put onto film or television. And in fact, I remember reading quite a while ago that there was a live television performance of a Shakespearean play in the early 1950s, when a great deal of television was live and not taped. And that program was Hamlet, filmed in New York City. And it was said that the viewership for this play, Hamlet, was greater than everyone who had seen the play in the last 400 years. That one showing on television had more viewers than the history of this play. So that's the power of adaptation of the plays of Shakespeare onto television or the screen, which should give greater exposure to the plays and hopefully an appreciation of the stories of the plays. However, when I talk to young people and young viewers, I ask them, yes, do you know Shakespeare? And they say, oh yes, we do. Do you have a favorite play? Not really. What plays did you study in high school? And invariably they remember Romeo and Juliet, and they hate it. With a few exceptions. Just last week I spoke to someone who said their favorite Shakespearean play was Romeo and Juliet because after they studied it in school, she watched the movie that starred Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. And there I think is the key, as I've mentioned, that the really important element in the study of Shakespeare at an early age is to see it either on the stage, which is exciting for any high schooler to see a play of any kind performed live, obviously, or to see it on a big screen, either a movie version or a television version. I believe that it really opens the door to the appreciation of Shakespeare such that when they go back to class and start to look at the play, look at the words, look at how the play is constructed, I'd like to think there would be a greater appreciation of his plays that would lead to a study of his poetry, the spectacular sonnets that he wrote. And I know it's pretty easy to gush about Shakespeare and say, oh, this is wonderful or this is incredible. I will try to keep that to a minimum. So let's just say the over 130 sonnets that Shakespeare wrote and appreciate those as well. In fact, just recently, I saw two things on television that I thought were again the key to keeping Shakespeare alive and having new audiences appreciate them. One was on a talk show or a chat show in England, and the speaker was Judi Dench. Now, whether or not you know who that actress is, you might remember her as being the female M on many, many James Bond movies. And she recited a sonnet that begins, "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes." Now, it was an English audience. There were 4 or 5 people on the chat program, all sitting on the couch, and she recited from memory the entire sonnet. The result was an enormous amount of applause, cheering and almost screaming, because of course, she is a very trained Shakespearean actress and has a tremendous way of delivering this sonnet. The other was on a US show, and I don't know which talk show host it was, but a fellow by the name of Sir Ian McKellen, who audiences might know as Magneto on the X-Men movies of recent date, but he is also what's known as a classically trained actor. And he stood up and walked away from the couch and spoke a soliloquy from one of Shakespeare's lesser known plays, but it was about foreigners, it was about immigrants. And you could have heard a pin drop when you watched that video. It was completely silent except for his voice. And of course, he is classically trained. He has a magnificent voice. He can deliver that speech as well as any actor who's ever been around. And at the end, again, there was screaming. The audience, this is an American audience, not a British audience who might have a greater familiarity with Shakespeare, and they went crazy. Again, to me, suggesting that there is hope for keeping Shakespeare alive, and I think the key is to see it before you read it. If we want new audiences to become exposed to Shakespeare and become lovers of Shakespeare, we have to explain why this is a good thing to do. Now, Sir Kenneth Clark, in his tremendous series called Civilization, also released in 1968, said, "How do you talk about a genius on this scale? How do you add to what's already been said over 400 years about the quality of his plays and poetry, how timeless so much of it is? Where do you begin? And not if you cannot say anything new, what can you say without gushing? Like, oh, they're really, really good, or they're timeless, or they're memorable." So I'm going to start with the native English speaker. The other group is non-native speakers who either acquire English or see the stories in their own language. I don't know how possible it is to appreciate Shakespeare if your first language is not English. Now, I've heard the same thing said about a French writer, a very, very famous French writer called Voltaire. And even this same Sir Kenneth Clark said, no one can really appreciate how great a writer Voltaire was unless they know French, his use of the language. And this brings us back to Shakespeare. His use of the language, the music of the language, is what attracts native English speakers to his work. We all speak English, native speakers. We all use words like he used words. There have been many poets and many playwrights, but when you get exposed to the plays, let's say, before the poetry of Shakespeare, it's amazing how he puts words together. He tells the stories that were common at the time, comedies, tragedies, histories, but it's his commentary first and how he puts the words together to tell the story. I don't know how much more you can go into that other than to say you have to hear it to believe it. You have to hear things like a rose by any other name still smells as sweet, or parting is such sweet sorrow, the evil that men do lives on after them. And again and again and again. There are so many examples of speeches, of monologues, of soliloquies that have been repeated over the centuries, perhaps to a point where the high school kids get sick of it. I remember people making fun of Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Because we've heard it a million times on television, maybe in a movie, maybe by comedians, because it's so commonplace. But when you follow the entire play, when you get exposed to more and more Shakespeare, you can really appreciate his use of language. And so I don't think that translates easily to the non-native speaker. If people acquire their English and become very good at English, can they appreciate the music of Shakespeare's language? I'd like to think so, but I'll never know to what extent that's possible because I am a native English speaker. The second reason why I think we should be exposed to the work of Shakespeare is how varied his work was. In today's world, we might have a detective fiction writer, a police procedural writer, and they pretty much stick to that subject that they know well and are successful with it. We might have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and it has been said that in his lifetime he wanted to do something else. He was tired of writing about Sherlock Holmes and he wanted to write other things. And he did, and none of them were nearly as successful or as well received as his Sherlock Holmes stories, which clearly was his forte. And then we have historical writers, we have comedy writers who might be involved in more dramatic elements and comedy, but Shakespeare is probably unequaled in the fact that he wrote histories, he wrote comedies, and he wrote tragedies. And I just read last week that after the Greek moment of the 5th century BCE, The next time tragedies were written as incredibly well or as moving as the Greeks was 2,000 years later when Shakespeare did it. So it's his variety, his ability to write comedy, his ability to write histories, his ability to write the tragedies, of course, the depth of the characters he creates, regardless of what his source material was. When he's finished with it, it's Shakespearean. And you can study it, and there's a lot of talk of where he got the stories from, how they weren't, many of the stories weren't new, but were adaptations. So what? The result is Hamlet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, and on and on and on. I believe there was around 37 plays that he wrote, and over 130 sonnets or poems that he wrote. I particularly like, after the very famous Shakespearean plays, the histories. I'm just a big fan of history to begin with. And so Henry V, Henry IV, Part 1, Part 2, Richard III, Richard II. I just like these stories. They're interesting stories because they're about history and about the life and death of kings and nobles. And if you read Richard III, you walk away never forgetting a horse, my kingdom for a horse, or the beginning of the play, which is, now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this Duke of York. It just stays with you. So I like the histories very, very much. So it's his variety, and of course the level of excellence he achieves with everything he wrote, that I believe is what we should recommend to people who don't know Shakespeare. Do you like stories about revenge? Do you like violent stories? Do you like action stories? Do you like romances? Do you like sad stories where the hero gets into lots of trouble, where young lovers get into even bigger trouble? If you like all those things, then Shakespeare has an answer for you to every one of those kinds of stories. We want to make a movie from a Shakespearean play. We know that Shakespeare has got a tremendous wealth of material. The stories are timeless, the characterizations are deep, the action can be intense, and now we've got to make a movie out of it. And that process is called adaptation. These are not original screenplays, needless to say. They are adaptations of the plays. And this is a very, very difficult field in which to make a film. Moving from the stage to the screen, I believe, is an enormously difficult task. Because if you think of going to a theater and seeing a play live, there's a stage that has a very small space, relatively speaking, and all the action of the play takes place on that stage. Now, there's incredibly inventive ways to tell the story on the stage with the props and the settings. It is magnificent when you do see a play. And I have seen several plays, just regrettably, none by Shakespeare. So you have to be, the movie makers have to be very careful when they translate that stage play to the screen, because it can be static. It can be claustrophobic. If we're just going to take the play and put it on film, it usually doesn't work out very well. The good thing about adapting a Shakespearean play is in many of the plays, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, there's a lot of action, lots of scenes, lots of things going on. And so there's an opportunity to make it cinematic, as opposed to just sticking a camera in front of a stage and watching the play unfold. However good the actors are, and of course, however incredible the material is, it needs to be cinematic. And I think this is a tremendous challenge for movie makers, because if you've seen plays adapted to the screen, as serious moviegoers, or let's say people who've watched movies for a long time, you've seen some that look very static and very claustrophobic. So for our film Romeo and Juliet, there's a lot of scenes in this play, a lot of action, and you can go way beyond just filming the play from a stage and making it very, very cinematic. And in fact, our version of Romeo and Juliet, this 1968 version, I think the director, whose name was Franco Zeffirelli, does a spectacular job in making it cinematic. The fight scenes, and there are a few fight scenes, are terrific. They take place in an old town. It happens to be Verona, and they look great. And there's movement. And I think he purposely makes the fights very in a larger area. And the sword fights that take place over here, and then they run down some steps, and they go into the square of the city, and they go into a side street of the city. There's a really genuine effort to make the film cinematic. And then there are several scenes, of course. There's scenes inside palaces. There's a scene in a hall where there's a party. There's the scene outside the house of Juliet, one of the most famous scenes in all of not only movie making, but in all of storytelling history. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo, etc., etc., etc. And so this is critical, I think, for a cinematic version of a play to succeed. And as I've said, many have, I wouldn't say failed, but haven't been as exciting or as entertaining, or you come out of the film and you say, I should have just watched that on the stage as opposed to the movie theater. And so that's why I say it's very challenging to successfully make this adaptation. Books to movies can be just the same. Sometimes books have too many characters for the screen, too many scenes, too many subplots. So when movie makers take a very involved story, 400 or 500 pages long, and they want to make a 2-hour movie, they've got to shorten it. They've got to eliminate some characters. They've got to do certain things to make it far more watchable over a 2-hour period, let's say. The same is true for adapting Shakespeare's plays. I only know of one film, and I'm sure there's more than one film where every word of the play was filmed start to finish. And that film was Hamlet, the one directed and starred in by Kenneth Branagh. That's a 4-hour movie, and I understand that every word that Shakespeare wrote in that play is in that movie. And I happen to love that film very much. But I would say it's not the first film that new moviegoers or moviegoers who have not been exposed to Shakespeare should watch. I think there are other ones that might be a better introduction, such as Romeo and Juliet, such as Julius Caesar, such as Macbeth. And Macbeth has been made many, many times, both by English-speaking directors and, in one case, a magnificent case, by a Japanese director, and that movie was called Throne of Blood. So Macbeth, lots of action in Macbeth. A very, very tough film, can be made very nasty, which can appeal to people who like lots of action and maybe a certain amount of violence. When they adapt these plays, there are things they take out. Now, I'd like to think, and as far as I can tell, nobody writes new dialogue for any of these movies, at least when they are trying to be honest to the play and not doing an adaptation that completely changes everything. But so for our film Romeo and Juliet, there is, of course, from what I can tell, no additional dialogue, nothing written that hadn't been written in the first play, in the original play, but there have been scenes cut or pieces eliminated, characters eliminated, say, because the powers that be say, okay, we're going to make this movie, we want it to be cinematic, we want it to flow from beginning to end, and so this might not work here, this might not work here, this reference to the stage might not work here, so let's make these choices, let's cut these parts out, and what we have left, we think, is a far superior cinematic experience. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. Yes, Branagh's version, where he doesn't cut a word and everything that's in Hamlet is on the screen, is wonderful, is a good contribution to the cinematic world of Shakespeare, but it may not work for every one of the plays. So I don't have any difficulty with the powers that be, the director or whoever is behind the film, saying, we have to modify this play to suit our cinematic needs. And generally speaking, that works out quite well. I love so many of the adaptations of Shakespeare into movies. Julius Caesar from 1953, I think, is spectacular. Roman Polanski's Macbeth, that made in, I think, the early 70s or late 60s, is a terrific film to see. Throne of Blood. I even like a mid-60s or early 70s version of Antony and Cleopatra. Not the Cleopatra movie with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, although I do kind of like that one. But this one is actually taken from the play, starring, of all people, Charlton Heston, who most viewers may not remember. But there have been many terrific adaptations of Shakespeare's plays, and I'd have to say my favorite is our play, Romeo and Juliet, released in 1968. So that brings us to our movie, Romeo and Juliet. And there's absolutely no point in trying to critique the story of Romeo and Juliet. I think it's a fabulous story. Who am I to say that it doesn't connect well, or this scene doesn't strike me as well as it should have been done or written or something? I'm just one of those, I love every word, I love every minute. This is my favorite play by far. It is a tragedy. Shakespeare, as I said, was a very prolific writer and had his fingers in every kind of story. He wrote comedies, he wrote histories, and he wrote tragedies. And the full title for this play is The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. But it is so much more than that. So let's look at our story. And what I like, first of all, about our story is there is no problem with spoiler alerts, because right at the beginning of the movie and the play, we are told that Romeo and Juliet are going to have a very bad ending. There's a prologue to the play, very famous prologue, and it tells us what's going to happen in the next 2 hours. The two households, both alike in dignity, and then they say, from forth the fatal loins of these two foes, these warring families, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. So we know in the first 30 seconds of the film, Romeo and Juliet are not going to make it. So how does that work? And the answer, of course, is it does work. And how does it work? So I've seen this film so many times, and I'm not going to think, well, maybe, just maybe, this time I watch it, they're going to survive, because I know they're not, and the whole audience knows they're not. So what is the key here? Once again, it is execution. How does the story unfold? Who are all the players involved? How do these two young lovers, and they're very young lovers, end up where they end up? And what does the play have to say about love, friendship, betrayal, jealousy, hatred, the hatred of two families? What does it have to say about all those things? And how are all these issues ultimately resolved? So that's our story. We have two families, both alike in dignity. The Montagues and the Capulets. Juliet is the daughter of the Capulet family, and Romeo is the son of the Montague family. And these two groups are fighting each other on a regular basis, such that in our fair town of Verona, the prince of the city says, if you do this anymore, you're going to get into serious trouble. But of course, there's a lot of young men in this story, and they have to fight. They have to defend the honor of their families, and they're both emotionally unrestrained. And that is on the Montague side, Mercutio, and on the Capulet side, Tybalt. Kind of cool names. I love those names. And they are going to fight. Now, the younger member of this group, of the Montagues, is Romeo. And when the story opens, we find out that he's not around when the first little rumble occurs. And we find out that he's moping. He's moping around because he's madly in love, but it's unrequited love. Now, Romeo is 16 or 17 in the story. When we meet Juliet, we find out that she is not quite 14 years old. And even in the play, which was written in 1594, they go to some lengths to explain that being married at the age of 13 and 14 was not unusual for the times. And in fact, Juliet's mother apparently was married right around the same age that they want Juliet to marry. So this was not unusual. We'll just leave it there. Because the play is not about underage love. The play is about love. One of the things, love. So I think this is a tremendous element to the story, that Romeo is in love with someone named Rosaline. And wait a minute, aren't we watching Romeo and Juliet? And the answer is, he initially is in love, madly in love, with somebody else. So our story opens with a bit of a rumble, good one, really good sword fight, and this is an age in which there are swords and not guns. They get into trouble, they have to separate, but there is very bad blood. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. I just love that prologue. So we meet up with our hero, Romeo. I think brilliantly cast for an actor named Leonard Whiting. He's my favorite Romeo, and as I've said, there's been many versions of Romeo and Juliet. DiCaprio, as a young man, played him much later, but I really love this casting of Leonard Whiting as Romeo. Very good looking like he's 16 or 17 years old, not looking 25 or anything like that. And we find out that he wants to finally hook up with Rosaline. Well, one thing leads to another, and there's a party in the town. And this is something that's done every year, and the Capulets are very proud of having this festivity, and they invite basically the whole town to attend. And it's a masked ball. I think masked balls are kind of cool. I don't know if they still exist, maybe they do, but I think it'd be kind of fun to have a regular masked ball every year in every town. So the Montagues basically crash this party, but they wear masks and they're not there to fight or cause any disruption. They're just there to crash the party and have a good time, and I suppose drink somebody else's wine and eat their food. Now this party, as I said, is put on by the Capulets. And of course, Juliet's there, and all of the immediate family and the relatives of the Capulets are there. So we're having a pretty good party. And what is unique to the film and not the play is there's a song at this party. And it was very well received. It has a haunting melody. And when I watch this film, it's in my head for days and days afterwards. And it's titled simply, "What is a Youth?" And if anyone who's seen this version of Romeo and Juliet, they know what I'm talking about. I think the song was released into public domain and did quite well. The author of it, or the person involved who was in music for the film, I think his name was Nino Rota. Perhaps there's only one other Italian as accomplished as Nino Rota, and that would be Ennio Morricone, which we'll talk about in another episode. But it's just perfect for the film. It's a theme. The melody of the song is used again and again for the rest of the film, but we only hear it initially at the party. And when we hear this, when he sings this song, the camera does its work. And I have to say, this is Zeffirelli's incredible genius to use the camera to bring together Romeo and Juliet. Because as Romeo is ogling Rosaline, he just looks so, not really sad, but he's just so excited about, there's Rosaline, she's right over there. I love her like I've loved nobody else. And then his head turns and he sees Juliet. And all of a sudden, Rosaline no longer exists, and he falls madly in love, perhaps the most famous love at first sight that has ever been in any story told for the last 3,000 years. He falls in love with Juliet. We can tell by his expression and how he tries to maneuver to get close to Juliet, because they're dancing and he ends up involved in the dance with his mask on. And it also tells us that, reaffirms that Romeo is young. Is this foolish love? He loves Rosaline, maybe he loves somebody else before Rosaline, maybe now he loves Juliet, maybe he's going to love somebody else. So we know he's young, impulsive, impetuous, the love of a child, of an adolescent, which is mentioned in the film. But our story is going to tell us that, no, this is the real thing. And of course, the language of Shakespeare and the conversations between Romeo and Juliet are not the words of young children. They are the words for the ages. They are the most beautiful, I think, romantic poetry ever written, or as beautiful as any romantic poetry ever written. And that's sort of where our story begins. He manages to speak to Juliet. Now, she is 13 and a half, 13 and 3/4 years old. By the way, very beautiful. And again, inspired casting. The actress who plays Juliet in this film is Olivia Hussey, was her name. And again, it's my favorite Juliet. There's been many Juliets over the years, but she's absolutely my favorite. She looks young. She doesn't look 17, and I believe by the time of the film's release, she was 17. She looks very young, but she's very voluptuous, which is not unusual for a girl of an early teen. And I just think it works. And the chemistry between these two is undeniable. They immediately are attracted to each other. They don't know that one's a Capulet and one's a Montague. That at the beginning, they don't know this. They discover this later. And that's how part of this story begins. Well, we know that they become very enamored of each other, and again, the poetry of their conversations when they go home after the party, and Juliet's up in her room, and she's outside on the balcony of sorts, staring at the moon and thinking about this young man she saw at the party, and Romeo finding a way to climb the wall of the household, go over the brushes and all this. It's very acrobatic. It's kind of funny. And he ends up seeing her on the balcony and watching her as she speaks, of course, to the moon, and all this wonderful, wonderful poetry. And one thing leads to another, and they want to become inseparable. So for me, the key to this story happens in the ensuing scenes, and that key element is Friar Lawrence. Because Friar Lawrence, and believe me, if you've watched any Shakespeare or any English movies or theater, friars are not their favorite people. Monks, friars, priests, they're not their favorite people. But Friar Lawrence knows Romeo well, knows he's a young, foolish kid who is easily infatuated, and he thinks that Romeo is again upset because he still hasn't found his way with Rosaline. And Romeo basically responds with a really clever line to him. And what Friar Lawrence realizes is, hey, this is a bad thing that these two kids love each other. One's a Capulet and one's a Montague. But then he thinks, if these two kids come together, maybe they can end the feud between these two families. And that's why this character, I think, is so important to the plot of the story, to the development of the story. Because for us, the audience, we see, okay, this isn't an impossibility. There's hope here that these two can get together. They can ultimately get the blessing of their families, and all's well that ends well. And that's where the story really takes off. And we see how they can try to get together, what is happening with the families, how they're still very mad at each other. And of course, something happens soon after with our friend Mercutio and Tybalt that really kicks the movie into high gear, the story, and sets the stage for a tragedy. And so we have the music, the melody, which is used again and again in the film, usually around Romeo and Juliet. We have some great sword fighting scenes, and I mean, for my money, as far as I'm concerned, I think they're terrific, because there's been a lot of sword fighting scenes in Hollywood movies that can look a little artificial, cannot look very nasty, that looks like actors using swords. But this looks really good. They're really tough. Everybody gets down and dirty. There's a fight between two main elements, and something really bad happens in that 5 minutes of film that kicks the film to the next stage. I love the fight scenes. The language they speak around the fight scenes and at the end of the fight scenes is very memorable, to the point where Mercutio says to everybody, "A plague on both your houses." Another very memorable line from this play, Romeo and Juliet. So, Friar Lawrence has a solution. All of a sudden, it looks like Romeo and Juliet getting together. It's just not going to happen. But he has another idea. And when you see the movie, you'll see that it's a pretty good idea. It's pretty ingenious. is very much of the time. It involves potions and poisons and crazy things that you can put into a vial of whatever and drink it and funny things happen. Probably not terribly scientific, but it's a plot device and it works very well. And in fact, it's been used probably thousands of times ever since Romeo and Juliet. So we think, okay, even at this late stage in the story, it looks like they're going to be able to get together. And that dramatic element, that tension, that thriller aspect to the story really drives the movie forward. We really get sucked in, at least I really get sucked in. And no matter how many times I see it, part of me thinks there's a chance. They are going to make it. And everything they've gone through is not going to be in vain. And so, as we all know, because there are no spoiler alerts for Romeo and Juliet, except to describe certain elements of scenes that explain why they end up where they end up, they don't make it. And it is beautifully photographed from start to finish. The last 15 minutes are wonderful, sad, terrifically sad, of course. It is a tragedy. And it just, I think by the end of the film, it just, I feel, every time I feel sad, no matter how many times I watch this film, I feel this tremendous joy at watching something so incredible, so near perfect in its, the execution of this 1968 version, the huge cast that were all probably classically trained and do a tremendous job, so convincing. England has this incredible stable of classically trained actors and actresses who just take on Shakespeare. They want to take on Shakespeare. They want to be in these plays, and the results are spectacular. So I have an enjoyment for the film. I feel sad at the end of the film, and I actually can't wait to watch it again. And in that case, I will get ready, even knowing what the ending will be prepared to be joyful and sad at the same time from the 22nd row.